The BankservAfrica Economic Transactions Index, also known as the BETI, has registered its highest level ever. The BETI rose by 9.9% in May compared to the same time last year, registering a number of 143.5 index points. This was a substantial increase on the 4.9% increase recorded for April. Well, to tell us more, I'm joined by Independent Economist Elize Kruger. Thank you very much, Elize, for joining us. Now, before we get into it, please explain to us what exactly the BETI measures.
So the BETI measures the value, the standardized value of all debit and credit transactions in the economy. So it does give an indication of economic activity. And over time, we have tracked that there's a very good correlation between what's happening to the BETI in terms of value of transactions in the economy compared to economic growth. I must just add that the value of transactions are deflated, so the impact of inflation is stripped out, as well as the impact of seasonal adjustments. So the data gets adjusted from the nominal value into a real value at constant prices to reflect the BETI values.
Okay, so when we look at the headline movement, why do you think that there was this rapid rise in transactions in the month of May? What speaks to this?
Yes, it was actually stronger than what I would expected at this time. You know, we've had a lot of negative factors and headwinds in the economy, and one would have expected that it would have had more of a negative impact on the BETI. But we saw actually exactly the contrary of that. So I think what we are seeing is that there are a number of factors in the economy that continue to keep the economic growth and the underlying momentum resilient. There's quite a number of factors, you know, thinking about job creation. So in Q1, we had 370,000 new jobs created, which will have a spillover effect in terms of economic activity and transactions in the economy. Then also we had at the end of April, you'll recall, lifting of the restrictions from COVID-19. So on the side of hospitality and tourism and so on gatherings, there's definitely an impetus that I think we could have seen only in May, given that those restrictions got lifted end of April. Yeah. So that's another factor, and a long list if you want me to elaborate, Nombu.
Now, it's interesting you make those comments because you're reflecting on what happened in the first quarter. But when you look at the fundamentals of the economy right now, does the May number look like it could have been a blip, or do you see there being a potential for this momentum to continue, given all the headwinds that we have in our economy?
Yes, at this point in time, it does suggest that it will continue in terms of growth in Q2 compared to Q1. So I think in April specifically, we are seeing a couple of negative numbers coming out that was mostly related to the floods in KZN, impacting heavily negative on manufacturing and on the transport and logistics sector. But some of the other sectors like retail actually held up quite well in April, for instance, and moving into May, I think we could continue to see that momentum. That is what the BETI is telling us, that maybe the underlying momentum is stronger than what we currently think it is.
And then just shifting away from the BETI, but still talking about the fundamentals of the economy, there's an expectation of further bruising in terms of the fuel hikes coming in July. What will this mean for inflation, since you are an inflation guru, and what sort of impact do you expect this to have on consumers?
Yes, indeed, there are more fuel price hikes on the cards, and it will be negative from an inflation point of view. On the one side, we'll have a direct negative impact on the CPI basket. And then also we have a big risk that it could maybe spill over into second round effects on inflation. So that will be negative, and it will place another or more pressure on the pockets of consumers. The disposable income of consumers will remain under pressure.
You economists like to use that term second round effects, and you talk about issues of core inflation. When that number starts ticking up, of course it's negative because it might get the Reserve Bank more, to be inclined to raise interest rates higher. But in a way, it's also a good thing that that's moving because it indicates that the economy is growing to some degree.
Yes, second round effects, is typically when you see that the higher fuel price will end up in a generalized increase in price levels because of the fact that companies would be unable to absorb the full extent of the impact of higher fuel prices on their businesses. So it does have a negative impact overall, on the economy. So we will have to see how that plays out in the sense how resilient consumers can continue to be. Well, up till this point, I'm surprised to see that actually the economy is holding up quite well, despite, for instance, the large increase that we've seen already in the fuel prices.
Of course, we are still a month away before the Reserve Bank makes a decision, but speculation is rife after what we've seen happen in the United States with, a 0.75% increase in the US. Do you think that our Reserve Bank is going to be forced to make a similar move, or our fundamentals are different such that they could afford just to increase by 0.25 of a percentage point?
Well, at this point in time, I do think that they might increase by another 50 basis points, a similar magnitude increase compared to the previous meeting. The fact that the US opted for a 75 basis point increase, I think we will not see that in South Africa. We are not seeing a similar scenario playing out in terms of inflation compared to what's happening in the US and some other developed economies. In South Africa, we are looking at an average of around 6.4% for the year in terms of headline inflation, compared to internationally where they are struggling with inflation between 8 and 9%. So I do not forecast a big 75, but I think there's a good chance for a 50 basis point hike. And specifically given that the Reserve Bank would argue that they are still at this point in time into negative territory in terms of real rates, so i.e. our inflation rate is above our benchmark interest rate. So they consider even a hike at this point in time to still be a scenario where monetary policy is in the loosening sort of phase. Only when you start to see your rates above inflation and you've got a positive real interest rate, the bank will start to think about that as a more restrictive monetary policy stance. So from that point of view, I think they will continue to hike, but I do not foresee more than 50 basis points.
Okay, Elize, we're going to leave it there, but thank you very much for your time and insights, specifically on the BETI and inflation. Elize Kruger, she's an independent economist.